Hello, everyone. Welcome. Give everyone a few seconds to join. And we have just a few housekeeping items. You are all muted, so you don't have to worry about that. And the meeting will be recorded, so you'll receive an email tomorrow with a link to watch the recording, as well as some other resources. And during the webinar, if you have any questions, please post those in the questions box, and we'll be monitoring those, and we'll try our best to get those answered. So thanks.
Mary, you're up when you're ready.
Okay, I was going to say, Elizabeth, let us know when we're ready. So I'm going to get started. I want to welcome everyone. My name is Mary Kolick, and I am a member of the Orange-Durham Chatham League of Women Voters, and I'm the chairperson of the Chatham Education Foundation. We are welcoming you on behalf of actually 3 organizations, the League of Women Voters, specifically 3 locals that collaborated: Charlotte-Mecklenburg, Lower Cape Fear, and Orange-Durham Chatham, Public Schools First, and the Chatham Education Foundation. And although each of us is a unique nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, we all agree that an understanding of the 20-year history of the Leandro case, and most importantly, the recent judicial decisions and related recommendations, are essential to achieving the promise that I hope we're all in agreement of providing each student, every student in our state, equal access to sound basic education. We recognize that a robust and equitable public education system is foundational to the long-term prosperity and quality of life of North Carolinians. Our democracy relies on the informed and active involvement of the public and our willingness to pursue and act on our principles of democracy and the loftiest goals that relate to that. Given that our goal is to educate and inform North Carolinians about critical public education issues that affect certainly all of our children, our teachers, our communities, and we hope to engage all stakeholders in supporting this unified system of high quality public education. There is no better resource, given that that is their mission, than Public Schools First in terms of helping us really delve down and dig deep and understand Leandro, the history, but most particularly any recent judicial decisions and planning that really provides us with a pathway forward in terms of meeting the promise, certainly of a sound basic education, but hopefully what we all aspire to is high quality education that prepares every one of our children to be strong global citizens. I am very pleased that Lynn Edmonds, who's going to be our presenter tonight, agreed to do this and has been working diligently at it. Lynn is the Outreach Director for Public Schools First and Great Schools in Wake. She's a proud North Carolinian, I think from Durham, grew up in Durham with her husband. She is a product of public schools and is sending her children to public schools, so has a strong heart and advocacy for that. Lynn graduated from Peace College. She's been a strong advocate, both as a volunteer and now certainly professionally for education and certainly public education in the state of North Carolina. She is also works on the county, she is a at-large position on the Wake County Board of Library Commissioners. And just in general, I think as so many of you all are, because I know many of the people that are on, and I can believe that many of you just have a strong commitment to your community. So thank you for joining in tonight. Being educated about policy puts you in a position of not being reactive, but being proactive. And if you want to feel empowered in terms of your life and the life of your family, friends, and community, there's nothing more important than understanding how our government works and what the policies are and how we can affect them. So I'm going to turn it without further ado over to Lynn. We're looking at about a 40-minute presentation, but we do want people to participate, albeit it's a little bit difficult sometimes virtually, but there is a chat where you can be entering questions. Lynn will be stopping so we can address those questions periodically during the presentation. And then at the end, we're hoping to leave a good amount of time for questions, answers, and comments. So Lynn, it's Over to you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you everybody that's attending tonight, and thank you to the League and all the organizations that are involved in this event. I've talked with several of you over the last couple of months, and I know that this has been a lot of work, and I want to applaud your efforts and really appreciate you inviting me. I'm very honored to participate. Public Schools First, NC, is a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit advocacy organization. We do grassroots advocacy, and that means that we are focused on empowering North Carolinians to be informed and have the tools that they need to advocate for our public schools. Like the League of Women Voters, we are a 501c3, and we do not endorse candidates or political parties. We do, however, take very strong positions on issues, and you're going to hear more about that during my presentation. Tonight, I have been invited to talk with you about the Leandro case and what's known as the West Ed report that was released late last year. I'm going to start with a history of the Leandro case and an overview of that, and then move into a pretty detailed as we can be in 40 minutes about the West Ed report. But I do have a couple of spaces where I'm going to pause for questions. I don't know that any of you want to hear me talk for 40 minutes straight, so we've built in a couple of two pause breaks so that we can try to entertain a couple of questions. And again, I want to thank you for this opportunity. Oh, now my screen won't advance. Give me just a second. Sorry, you all. All right, there we go. So what is Leandro? Leandro is a lawsuit that was filed in 1994, and it was filed by 5 low-wealth counties in North Carolina. It was filed specifically by parents, students, and school districts in 5 rural counties of North Carolina. Those are Cumberland, Hoke, Halifax, Robeson, and Vance. And the plaintiffs argued that North Carolina was in violation of our state constitution by not providing adequate or equitable funds to enable students to receive a sound basic education. And that is something that is promised to them in our state constitution. This was especially true, they argued, for students in these low wealth communities, and especially true for students of color. So what does our Constitution say? It says that the state is responsible for providing a sound basic education for all children. Not all states have this type of language in their Constitution, but North Carolina does, and that is the basis and the foundation of the Leandro lawsuit. So again, the case was filed in 1994, and the first thing that the state did was try to have the case dismissed. And so it went all the way to the North Carolina Supreme Court. And in 1997, the Supreme Court ruled that the state was indeed in violation, and it allowed the case to go to trial. So that's 3 years. A lot of people wonder why this case has been drawn out for 26 years, and this sort of sets the stage. It took 3 years for the case to even go to trial. It goes to trial, and in 2002, there was a ruling from a lower court that the state was in violation, and they ordered the state to remedy that violation and to comply with the state constitution. The state appealed that decision, and it went to the Supreme Court again, and in 2004, the Supreme Court again ruled against the state. They upheld the lower court decision and said that North Carolina needed to comply with the state constitution. So this is 10 years, right? So the case is filed in 1994, and you fast forward, and it's 2004 that the North Carolina Supreme Court issues that second decision, and that's 10 years that students are not receiving a sound basic education. Between 2004 and 2016, the case was under the jurisdiction of Judge Howard Manning. And he held numerous hearings, and he did issue some rulings. For example, he ordered the State Board of Education to take over Halifax County schools, but he never issued an order telling the legislature to invest more funds in public schools. And that's different than the approach that Judge Lee has taken. I'm going to talk more about Judge Manning's decision in a couple of slides. So in 2017, Judge Manning retired. And at that time, when he retired, the state tried to have the case dismissed again. And this time, the new judge, Judge David Lee, it was under his purview to make that decision, and he declined to dismiss the case. So the case moves forward. And between 2017 and 2018, the plaintiffs and the state jointly asked for an independent agency to provide recommendations on how they could be in compliance with the Leandro decision and with the state constitution. Judge Lee appointed a group called West Ed to do that research, to do that study, and to make those recommendations. West Ed is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research group based in California, and this is the type of work that they do for districts across the country. In June of 2019, they gave their report, released their report to Judge Lee, and then in December, that report was made public. So what happens between December of last year and this summer? In January, Judge Lee ordered the State Board of Education and the legislature to submit action plans within 60 days of how they would respond to this report, recommendations of the report, how they would start to comply with Leandro. If you do that math or think about that calendar, you'll come to the conclusion that yes, the pandemic sort of intervened and interrupted that, and so that 60-day deadline was extended. In June, Governor Cooper and the State Board of Education submitted plans to the judge, but nothing came from the North Carolina General Assembly, which really has the power to remedy this situation and invest more money. There was no report submitted by the General Assembly. And that moves us to September of 2020. So this month, earlier this month, on September 1st, Judge Lee holds a very brief hearing. It only lasted about a half hour. I and I think Mary and some others of you listened in on that hearing. He signed a consent order ordering the state to invest $426.9 million more dollars, additional dollars, into education funding. This is additional money, and it was meant to be allotted this year in 2020-21, and it's the first step in an 8-year plan. And then the very next day, on September 2nd and September 3rd, the General Assembly convened to appropriate CARES Act money. Those are federal dollars for COVID relief. There was no discussion or debate about Judge Lee's order that had just been made 24 hours earlier. And then they adjourned until next year, until 2021. So I want to go back to something I said about Judge Manning, the first judge that had the Leandro case under his purview for so long. He never issued an order demanding that the legislature appropriate more funds for public education. Why didn't he do that? When you ask him about that, he says that he does not have the constitutional authority to do that. And I have listened to numerous conversations about this. I have watched interviews, I've watched news stories, etc. We had one of the lawyers on a webinar with Public Schools First several weeks ago. And according to him and others, apparently there is great debate even among legal experts, which I am not. But apparently there's great debate about whether or not the judge can actually force the General Assembly to appropriate more funds. And Judge Lee seems to think that he can because he took a different approach than Judge Manning. So what I would say to you is that if North Carolinians want something done to remedy this problem, it is going to require public outcry and public demand, public pressure. And that's going to include contacting our lawmakers and voting. There are some precedents from other states that North Carolina could look to. For example, one state, it's either Washington State or the state of New Jersey, There's two examples. One, they had a similar case, and the court system there fined that General Assembly $100,000 per day until they complied with the order. Another example, or another precedent, if you will, is a court in another state threatened to shut down the schools until the legislature complied with the judge's order. So there is precedent of what the court can do to force the General Assembly to comply. But I think the bottom line, it's going to come down to public pressure. Before we move on to the WestEd report, and I am going to pause for questions in just a minute, I just want to give you sort of a scope and big picture about public school funding in North Carolina. You can see here that the majority of our funding comes from the state, and that means the North Carolina General Assembly, about 66%. 24% of our dollars for public education comes from our counties, and that's our county commissioners. So it absolutely matters who you elect to your county board of commissioners in North Carolina. And then 10% is federal funding. What I also want you to understand is that over the last decade, a lot of funding responsibility has been pushed down to the county level. And at Public Schools First, we don't believe that that is the right approach for North Carolina. We believe that it is the state's responsibility to fund public education, and that it is not fair to push funding responsibility down onto our counties and onto our county governments. Here's something else that I want you to keep in mind as we move forward through this evening. This is a very sobering number. North Carolina's corporate tax rate has been slashed dramatically. Lawmakers have cut this tax rate every budget cycle since 2013, and we now have the lowest corporate tax rate in the United States at 2.5%. Some experts estimate that this costs our state about $3.6 billion per year. And if you note here, our neighbors to the north and the south of us in Virginia and South Carolina, their corporate tax rates are at 5%. So I think this is very important for us to keep in mind as we talk about the Leandro price tag, and as we talk about, well, what will it take to give students a sound basic education? How much would that cost? Where would the money come from? I think this number is very relevant to that conversation. And now, so we will take a look at the WestEd report, but this is where I want to pause for questions. And I don't know if Mary's going to come back on, or if Elizabeth or Zena.
I see no questions so far.
Okay, well, we'll move along.
Sorry, Lynn. We don't have any in the queue, but just a reminder in case you missed us, say it at the beginning. There is a questions box, so feel free to post a question, and we're monitoring that, and we'll try and get that answered.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And you all, Elizabeth, I know you can't see her, but she's on staff with us at Public Schools First NC, and we would not be doing this without her. So applaud silently for Elizabeth. Elizabeth, do we also have the chat function working, or both working?
There is a chat, but any questions you have, you should see a questions box. And we did get one while we've been waiting.
Okay.
Where can we find more information about the plan from Governor Cooper and school staff?
Oh, that's a great question. I believe we have that linked on our website. Now I'm struggling this second because the website is not in front of me, so I don't exactly know how to send you there without looking at it. But I'm sure, Elizabeth, if you'll make a note, we can include that. We're going to send you all links tomorrow, I guess, with a link to this video, and we can absolutely include a link to the report that Governor Cooper submitted. So, Elizabeth, do you mind making a note of that?
I will do so.
Thanks. All right, so let's dive into the WestEd report. It is an action plan for North Carolina, which we will touch base on that after we go through some of what the report says. All right, so I know this is a wall of words, but basically WestEd identified 8 critical needs in this report, and that's what you see on your screen. I am not going to read all of these to you because we're going to go through them one by one, and that might sound very daunting, but we're going to do that within our time allotment tonight. I'm just going to give you a high-level summary of each of these. And before I start going through these, I do want to encourage those of you that are really interested in this topic. I encourage you to find the WestEd report on our website or Google WestEd report North Carolina, Leandro. You'll be able to find it. And again, we've got it linked several places on our website, but it actually is a very accessible report. It's about 300 pages, but it's very well written. And for those of you that want to take a deeper dive into any of these 8 critical needs, I think you'd find it really, really useful and again, very accessible. All right, so critical need number 1 has to do with finances and resources. And WestEd makes 3 recommendations in this category. They say that North Carolina needs to prioritize higher needs students and provide flexibility to local school districts on how they spend state dollars. Over the last 7 years, much of that flexibility has been taken away from local districts, and it makes it very hard for them to fund their specific needs. Second, WestEd says to ensure stability in state funding, and third, to identify some small, high-impact investments. And what do they mean by that? By small, high-impact investments, one of the things they talk about increasing pay for pre-K staff, improving our teacher pipeline, and improving whole child supports like more counselors and social workers in our schools. So within critical need number 1, I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of things. We need to remember the slashing of that corporate tax rate. We also need to understand that North Carolina is ranked 49th in the United States in what's called funding effort. And that is how much a state spends on public schools relative to their GDP. And you see the source there, that's from the Education Law Center. It's a report called Making the Grade. North Carolina, again, ranks 49th in funding effort. We are 46th in per pupil spending, and that ranking has pretty much stayed stagnant, stayed the same for the last 10 or more years. We have been in that lower 40th ranking. We spend about $10 billion every year on public education or on education, and some people will point out to you that that is the largest piece of the state budget overall, and that is true. It is the largest piece of the state budget. We spend the bulk of our state budget on public schools. When you dig deep, however, into budget categories, that is where you find that we are actually investing less on things like textbooks, professional development, and more. Another argument you'll often hear is that we are spending more than we ever have before, that we're spending more in our history than we've ever spent on public education. That is also true. But again, when you take that deeper dive and get into the details, you find that we're lacking in several areas. And I'm going to illustrate some of those things as we move along. Critical need number 2 calls for a well-qualified and well-prepared teacher in every classroom. They make 9 recommendations in this category. We are not going to detail all 9, but you see the first 5 here. It's related to building our teacher pipeline, growing our teaching fellows program, developing teacher residency programs, developing grow your own programs, and hiring teachers of color. Mentoring and support for new teachers, developing advanced teacher roles, improving and growing professional development opportunities, and increasing teacher pay, especially enabling low wealth districts to compete in teacher recruitment and retainment. So again, don't have time to go through all 9 of those recommendations, but let's just break down a couple of those. With regard to North Carolina's teacher pipeline, enrollment in our university system of kids going into schools of education, Our enrollment is down more than 30% since 2011. And many bad policy decisions at the state level are contributing to that. The loss of master's degree pay, the loss of retirement health benefits starting in January of next year, loss of longevity pay, loss of due process rights, and more. Those have all hurt our teacher pipeline. As for our Teaching Fellows program, it was abolished altogether in 2011. 6 years later, the General Assembly brought a new version of it back. So in 2017, they introduced what we call Teaching Fellows Light. And we call it that because it is a fraction of the program that we used to have. You can see that here. The original Teaching Fellows program gave out about 500 scholarships per year to about 17 different schools or universities. And the new version gives out less than half of that, about 160 scholarships to only 5 schools. And if you'll remember on the previous slide, I can actually, let's see. I don't know if it's this one, it's hard for me to see. Oh, number 5, diversify the workforce. And we go back to here. There are no HBCUs, or historically black colleges. None of those are included in the current Teaching Fellows program. So that's going to make it much more of a challenge to diversify our teaching workforce. Critical need number 3, WestEd says that we need a well-qualified, well-prepared principal in every school, and they make 4 recommendations here. Update principal prep and licensure requirements, expand access to high-quality principal prep programs, expand professional development for principals and assistant principals, and revise salary structures and improve working conditions. I want to call your attention to number 4, which was about revising the salary structures and improving working conditions. What you need to know is that North Carolina ranks somewhere in the very bottom of pay for principals in the United States. We were 50th in the US in 2017, and I could not find our current ranking, but the changes that were made to the pay scale in 2017 did not move us far up the ladder. So we still hover, if we're not 50th, we're still hovering somewhere around the bottom. So how did the pay scale change in 2017? We went from a model that valued experience to a performance pay model, and that relies heavily on test scores. And you can see here that they introduced a $15,000 yearly bonus to principals based on test scores and raising test scores. It is our view that principals are not receiving the resources they need to make that happen, especially in our low wealth districts. And finally, I want you to see what WestEd had to say about the new pay plan. They say, quote, "The new compensation system creates a disincentive for effective principals to work in underperforming schools, which often take more than 1 year to improve and meet or exceed targets for growth." That is directly from the report in reference to the new pay model for principals that was introduced in 2017. Moving on to critical need number 4, which has to do with early childhood education. WestEd makes 4 recommendations here. Improve the pre-K teacher pipeline. And I'll just note that we really don't pay our pre-K teachers much at all. I think they start at minimum wage, and that certainly does not help us. Expand and increase quality and access to Smart Start. Expand North Carolina pre-K, and align and improve grade K-12 settings to promote early grade success. I'm going to explain what they mean by that 4th one in just a second. So early childhood education, here's a snapshot about North Carolina pre-K. Our enrollment in 2019 was about 29,000 children. There is a shortage of available pre-K slots across the state. Only about half of our eligible children are served. There are more than 50,000 children on the wait list for North Carolina pre-K. And the current state contribution for pre-K funding is about $5,200, and that is about 60% of the total cost. That leaves the remaining 40% to be covered by individual counties. Something that the WestEd report noted is that in the last budget cycle, so that would be 2017 to 2019, there were 44 counties, and we have 100 counties in North Carolina. 44 counties actually turned down their state dollars for pre-K because they could not come up with the remaining 40%. And I find that alarming and sobering and very upsetting. We at Public Schools First NC advocate for universal pre-K. We believe that every child that needs this resource in North Carolina should get it. There is no question that the research shows that a strong preschool foundation sets the stage for achievement in grades to come, in third grade, in middle school, and it also improves the probability that a child will graduate. So we are not funding at a level that meets all the needs of these students. And also under this category, critical need number 4 of early childhood education, that fourth point that it sounded maybe a little awkward about the grades K-12, about improving those environments. WestEd specifically points to restoring our teaching assistant positions in grades K-3. We have lost about 8,000 teaching assistant positions since the recession, and those positions have not been restored, and WestEd advocates for restoring those positions, as do we, because like pre-K, we believe that that is a foundational resource to help students achieve reading at grade 3 and academic success in the upper grades. And since we've gone through 4 of them, so I'm going to pause here for questions.
Okay, now we have some questions. First one, going back to the beginning, is what did Judge Manning actually accomplish during the years he was handling this case?
He did issue several orders about, like I said, he ordered the State Board of Education to take over Halifax County Schools, which they did. And those were the types of orders that he issued. There's another order that he issued that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. DPI had a program for improving low-performing schools, and he ordered for that program to be better funded and more resourced and to be more robust. And they achieved that for a very short time until DPI faced some cuts. And again, I'm going to cover that in a later slide, so I don't want to say more.
All right. Now we have a comment really saying that conservatives say that public education is failing, so they fund private schools. Money is not the answer.
I would argue that we have increased the education budget, but we've also increased enrollment. And we know what works, and we seem to, scale back, or, we find something that is working and then it gets cut. And we need to invest in these. I mean, the Supreme Court, has validated this lawsuit. Research shows that investments in things like universal pre-K and teaching assistants and per pupil spending, et cetera, those things work. And that is what we need to dedicate our funds to.
Okay, and finally, someone has asked why this is called Leandro, who Leandro was. And I see that in the chat, Yvonne Brennan has gone into some detail about answering that. So
yes, Leandro was one of the plaintiffs. It was the name of one of the plaintiffs. I can't see what Yvonne has typed, so I'll wait if you want to read that or.
Sure. Kathleen Leandro, individually and as a guardian ad litem of Robert A. Leandro and many other plaintiffs. So there were so many that they shortened the name of the case and they just used the first name of Leandro.
All right, are we ready to move on?
I think we are.
Okay. All right, so critical need number 5, support for high poverty schools. The recommendation, oh, excuse me, I'm off one slide here. Oh yeah, okay. The 5 recommendations here under critical need number 5: attract, prepare, and retain high qualified teachers and teacher mentors, provide additional time, resources, and access to programs that support the whole child, revise school accountability to better reflect gains, provide more helping professionals, that's a big one, we'll talk about that in a minute, and provide resources and supports to address out of school barriers. And let me pause right here. I'm going to mention out of school barriers on another one of the critical needs. The WestEd report identifies out of school barriers as things like food insecurity, housing insecurity, things that are there that the community, happen in the community that are outside of the school building. They do not go as far as to say, they don't advocate for expansion of Medicaid or anything about housing security or things like that. But I think it's really important to know that they recognize and encourage the General Assembly to address issues like that, because we all know that those things impact academic success. And so do understand that that's in the report a couple of times, and I invite you to dig deeper and have a look at that. All right, so under this category, under high poverty schools, one of the recommendation number 3 said to revise the school accountability system. That is referring to North Carolina's A through F school letter grades. And our letter grades we view as a privatization tool, in that if you promote the narrative that our schools are failing, you can then promote ways to leave the public school system. What you need to understand is that our school letter grade system is based on 80% test score and 20% growth. And I believe we are the only, of all the states that use this A through F grading system, we're the only one that weights test scores that heavily without a proper reflection of growth. So again, 80% test score, 20% growth. There have been numerous bipartisan efforts to adjust that formula so that growth has a heavier weight in the grade, and those have all failed. So after years of trying to get that formula adjusted, we still sit at 80% test score, 20% growth. The grades correlate directly with poverty, and that means that schools that are receiving the D's and the F's are schools with high concentrations of poverty, and schools that are receiving the A's and the B's are mostly affluent schools. Important here, traditional public schools, which is our free, open to all K-12 education system in North Carolina, those are graded. Our charter schools also receive these grades. Private schools that receive private school voucher funds or, quote, opportunity scholarships, those schools are not graded in the A through F letter grade system. Another of the recommendations under the critical need, number 4, is the call for more helping professionals. I tried to draw your attention to that just a second ago. This is a snapshot of what is recommended nationally and what North Carolina funds. And then in that third column, you see the averages of what our schools actually have. So on average, we do a little bit better than what North Carolina is funding, but that is because of those local dollars and local supplements. When I showed you that pie chart of where most of our education funding comes from, and I mentioned the fact that a lot of responsibility has been pushed down to the county level, this is one of these examples. Some counties, the counties that can afford it, are paying supplements and hiring, using local dollars to have more school counselors, more social workers, more school psychologists. So that's what you see in that third column. But just a couple of you can read this, but a couple of things to point out. So at the counselor and social worker level, it is recommended that you have one of those positions for every 250 students. North Carolina pays for 1 school counselor for every 413 students and 1 social worker for nearly every 2,000 students. School psychologist, it's recommended that you have 1 for every 700 students, but North Carolina pays for 1 for every about 2,400 students. The nursing calculation is a little bit more complicated just because those funds come from different sources. Through your county commissioners or through the health department, and some nurses are funded through grants. So that's where it's not quite as cut and dry with the nurses category. But I invite you to go back and look at this slide after tonight. All right, critical need number 6. We are going to skip this one because this is related to student assessment and standardized testing and student accountability. And it's pretty in the weeds, and just for time's sake, I thought it would be best to skip this one, but it is covered on pages 107 and 123 of the WestEd report. Critical need number 7, regional and statewide supports for school improvement. There's 4 recommendations here. 1 is to rebuild DPI's District and School Transformation Division. We're going to talk about that one specifically. Provide resources and supports for low-performing and high-poverty schools to address out-of-school barriers. There's that out-of-school barrier phrase again. Provide supports that facilitate culturally responsive curriculum. And extend supports that further MTSS, SWPBIS, and NC check-in. So what does all that mean? MTSS is multi-tiered system of support. I could not find what SW means. It might be Southwest, but PBIS refers to positive behavioral interventions and supports. And then NC check-ins is a program within DPI. So basically, they're calling for us to extend and increase support for those programs. All right, so that first one, DPI's District, School, and Transformation Model, or the DST model. What we need to understand here is that DPI, and this goes back to the question about what Judge Manning did. So this is what I was referring to here. This is one of the things that he did. They had been making gains at using their turnaround model for low-performing schools, and then they faced some very drastic budget cuts from the General Assembly. WestEd points out that DPI's District and School Transformation Model, that was their turnaround effort. WestEd remarks in their report that this program worked and had successes at turning around low-performing schools. It included leadership development for principals, community engagement and supports for the whole child. It included intensive professional development for teachers, and that took place inside these schools where these teachers teach. The teachers were not forced to come to Raleigh for these professional development opportunities. These leaders in DPI went into these schools in these communities and did the professional development there. This model was most robust for just a short 3-year period between 2012 and 2015, and that's in part because they also got federal race to the top dollars. But in 2015, the General Assembly made drastic cuts to DPI, and more than $5 million was cut from the Educator Support Services Department or Division, and that had a huge impact on this DST model. It is worth noting that Judge Manning had ordered this type of work, had ordered these interventions to take place in our low-performing school, and DPI did that, and again, they were having success. But now we are no longer in compliance with Judge Manning's order. Lindsay Wagner at the Public School Forum of NC, we are a partner organization with them. She did an extensive piece about these DPI budget cuts. That is a piece that was written in July of 2018. That's a link that we can send to you. Public Schools First NC, our organization, we also reported on these cuts in a document we have about the 2017-2019 budget. Overall, DPI received about a 14% cut in that 2-year period, and that really hurts their ability to help low-performing schools. All right, we're at the last one, critical need number 8, monitoring state compliance. This just is about, keeping track on the state's progress and keeping track on their compliance with the Leandro decision and with the recommendations that are found in this report. Judge Lee has ordered quarterly reports. The first one is due in December, and it will be very interesting to see what is in the December report, considering that the legislature has not responded to his order. They have not responded to Leandro. Remember, they didn't submit a action plan over the summer. So I'm as interested as any of you to see what the report will say in December. Finally, so we've gone over the 8 critical needs. You need to know that for each of these 8 critical needs, the West Ed makes very specific recommendations in an action plan. So we don't have to figure this out on our own, and lawmakers don't have to figure this out on their own. West Ed lays out an action plan for the next 8 years, or rather the next 4 budget cycles, and that is divided into 3 phases. That's on pages 140 and to 153 of the report. So what does this cost? This is the price tag of the recommendations in the report. It calls for North Carolina to invest $8 billion more over the next 8 years, or again, over the next 4 budget cycles. And it is reasonable to ask where $8 billion would come from. So I just want to remind you of this. And this is just one piece, but I just think it's very significant considering that we have the lowest corporate tax rate in the country. You saw this slide earlier, but I also want to make you aware that Judge Lee, in that hearing that I spoke about that he had on September 1st, he specifically said that North Carolina lawmakers must not allow the financial impacts of COVID-19 to stop them from complying with the Leandro decision and from giving all students a sound basic education and investing the funds that are necessary to do that. I just think that's important. All right, that concludes my slides. Well, sort of. I've got a few more, but we're going to take some questions. And again, Mary, I don't know if you want to come back or if Zena is going to do questions or what.
Okay, I have some more questions here. One is, please give an example of flexibility that's been taken away from local districts.
Great question. So districts used to be able to use their allotments for teacher funding. They could get somewhat creative with how they use that money, and they can no longer do that. It's more prescriptive. The legislature passed a K-3 class size mandate in 2017, I believe, and that really impacted local districts. They used to be able to have money so that they could determine, how many K-3 teachers they needed, and the lack of flexibility was going to force, and the K-3 class size mandate combined was going to force them to have to give up some of their specialist teachers to meet the K-3 class size requirement. So they've just lost flexibility. There's a really great document. I wish I'd pulled it out. I don't have it in front of me. I think it's called The Truth About Public School Funding, or The Truth About Public School Spending, and it's written by Philip Price, who used to be one of the financial directors over at DPI. And I don't have it in front of me, so I'm struggling to give you more examples. But they have lost flexibility in funding, and Yvonne might be able to put some details in the chat box.
Great. Okay. Also, what are neighboring states doing about pay and teacher conditions?
Say that again?
What are the neighboring states? You mentioned what their corporate tax rates are.
Yep.
What are they doing about teacher pay and teaching conditions?
Well, we are losing some of our teachers to our neighboring states because South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, they are paying our teachers better. And so our teachers in North Carolina that are on our borders are leaving North Carolina and going to those other states for better pay.
Okay. And which specific tests are the state using to reward school principals?
That I don't know. Specific tests that the state is using to reward, do you mean the $15,000 bonuses?
I would imagine so.
So those are going to be our standardized tests that students are given. They look at those test scores, and if you're a principal at a school where you have affluent students and students with lots of resources and fewer students of poverty in that school, your test scores are likely to be better. So it's going to be those principals that could get these $15,000 bonuses, even though they're the population of their students, it might be easier to raise those test scores. Again, our principals that are in our most high poverty schools are going to struggle to raise test scores, especially considering the lack of resources for textbooks, per pupil spending, special supports like more helping professionals in the school, counselors, social workers, etc.
Lynn, can I
Okay.
just jump in for a second?
Yeah.
This is Mary. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds. I know we have a few more slides, but there was a question previously about growth, and that some of your answer goes to, the way they measure the performance of teachers and administrators. There's a difference between measuring students against a standard that's developed for a grade level performance and measuring students based on where they started and where they ended because of instruction or because of all of the elements that go into an education during the course of a year, say. So
Right.
if I start way, far behind, but I grow a lot, but I'm still well below grade level, and I'm being measured on performance based on grade level, you can see where that's a real issue around equity, and particularly if the student's being measured against that standard, that says the student is a failure. It communicates that to them, but it also impacts teacher evaluation, principal evaluation, and all of those school report cards that we talk about. So that whole idea of public schools failing when it's grounded in narrow assessments that can only measure very narrow types of achievement, and then it's not informed by growth, you can see where that story about public schools failing can become, a story that is not understood well by the public.
Right. It's very problematic. And that goes back to that the A through F grading system that we have, the
Right.
formula that we have. It's 80% test score, which is a moment in time, a one moment in time where even schools, they may not have the test scores that we'd like to see, but they did achieve growth. But the growth is only 20%, at least with the A through F school grades. The growth is only 20% of that grade. So a school could still receive a D or an F even if they show significant growth because it's only weighted 20%, again, with regard to the A through F school grade. So that narrative of the failing school is very problematic. And Mary, you're right. It's not just problematic on paper. It is very shaming for students and for teachers. It's demoralizing to teachers that work very hard and do help their students grow academically, but they don't get the quote unquote credit, with this letter grade system that we currently have. And I find it frustrating. First of all, I don't believe in it. I don't think that we should have it. That's sort of our position at Public Schools First NC, is that we should not have these A through F school letter grades at all. But if we're going to have them, we absolutely need to improve that formula. And as I said to you earlier, there have been multiple bipartisan efforts to improve it, and they have all failed.
Okay, and Yvonne pointed out again that some of the tests are the EOGs and EOCs. One other question, who is responsible for preparing the December report?
Oh, coming up. So that's, I did not look to see, I don't know who has been appointed, and I'm sure I can find it, but I didn't look to see who has been appointed for this task force or collective of people that are supposed to do these quarterly reports. That is a team that Judge Lee put together. But again, I would expect the General Assembly and the State Board of Education to submit reports, but I believe in the WestEd report, they called for an independent review board, if you will, to do these quarterly reports and do the assessment of the state on compliance. And I don't have those details in front of me of who that board is or who makes up that body.
Great, and that's all the questions I have here right now.
Thanks. Yvonne, did you want to unmute and chime in about anything? Because we are running okay on time.
No, y'all have done an outstanding job presenting this information. And I do think that the report is due back, as Lynn said, by the governor and the State Board of Education, DPI, are the folks that the judge is expecting the reports from. And they're supposed to come back and say what's happened, what they're doing, what they're putting in place. What's fascinating to me is it will have nothing to do with the funding, because they can't answer the funding question, right? Because this goes right back to the General Assembly, which will not convene again, as Lynn pointed out, really for any in purposes of matter until January.
And I'm sorry, Mary, let me introduce, we can't see you, Yvonne, but Yvonne Brannon is the Director of Public Schools First NC, in case there's anybody in attendance that doesn't know who that is.
Thank you. So I think we have some additional slides that speak to exactly what Yvonne was just saying. When you're a teacher, you're taught to ask "so what" 3 different times to get to the real meat of it. So yep. I think we've got a few more slides that may speak to the "so what" of all of this. So for those people that are policy wonks, the "what can we do" is important. How can we be proactive around policy? How can we be active as citizens and as voters? And clearly, I don't think there's any more great example in terms of this year. This is a year that the electorate is electrified, I'll put it that way, between COVID, and it's a big election year. So I think people are longing to say, how can I have some empowerment around issues that I care about? And I would just offer, this is the League of Women Voters who is sponsoring this. And when you look at the League, their catchphrase is empowering voters and defending democracy. And we do that by informing people and encouraging them to be active in terms of understanding policy and advocates for issues that impact the public. And so this issue, education, whether you have a child that is in a public school or a grandchild or a child that's in a private school, or you have no children whatsoever, how public schools do impact the quality of our lives now and into the future. So it is an issue that matters to everyone. And again, it's not just self-serving, this is the village part of it. So what can we do? First and foremost, I would say voting, being informed, understanding policy, asking questions of your elected officials. A lot of times it's hard to get people engaged in the weeds, but it does matter. So finding something that you're passionate about and becoming educated around it in terms of the facts. Talking to your elected officials and talking to candidates, asking them about issues and where they stand is important. And I think if we go to the next slide, there's ways that you can do that and become informed. So one of the ways that the League of Women Voters does that is clearly, first and foremost, asking you to be engaged about the election process, understanding the voting process so that you can make a voting plan. And we ask everyone to have a plan to vote. There's multiple ways to do that this year. And I'm not going through detail, first of all, because it does change quite often, but second of all, because you want to have accurate information. So we really would encourage everyone. You can use the websites, but really go to your county board of education, board of education, you can tell a superintendent, board of elections, and you can talk to them. They give you clear, straightforward information about how to vote in your county. When you're interested in information about candidates, again, there's multiple sources. We, as a League of Women Voters, are actively engaged with Vote 411. There's a website you can go on. It tells you what's on your ballot. You can put your address in, and you can really dig down in terms of every single race, and every race matters, whether it's, you know, a local, state, and national elections. And you should know who's running. You should know for what office, who's running. And you should be able to go on and compare their responses to a range of questions about issues that impact us. And you can do that on Vote 411. So I would really encourage you to go to that website and take a look and drill down. It's fascinating to see people's response. This is just a sample of what it looks like. You can go to that slide on the website, on the next slide, and you can see all the different positions, and then you can drill down farther and see all of the different candidates and what they have to say. You can do a comparison chart for yourself if you're like me versus taking notes, and you can even look at a sample ballot and mark your ballot so that you can recall who it was that after careful study you've decided to support. So we really do encourage you to be informed. That is the way that democracy works. And our role is to try to help you do that in the best possible way. Our goal tonight was really to educate you. This is an open window of opportunity. It happens maybe every 20 years, where things that people have worked on that have become so important in terms of the next wave, or the next way that we go about doing things effectively. Right now, the West Ed report provided that after 20 years. And so we really do encourage everyone to take a deep look at this, to understand it, and then to act in your own interest and in the interest of your community in terms of taking it and asking about how it's going to be enacted locally and at the state level. So I don't know if the other slides are on here, but I think the other thing I would say is we aren't the only source. I think Public Schools First, Lynn, you said, has a source that's similar to this.
We do, and I'm not gonna change the slide because I didn't make that slide. I'll just tell you all that we will send it in the link tomorrow. But Public Schools First has a candidate questionnaire that we send to all state level employees, candidates. We send the candidate questionnaire to all state level candidates, and that includes candidates for the General Assembly. Once the primary is completed, we actively send it to everyone that's on the ballot for November. We don't have any control over whether or not they return it, but it is sent to everyone of both parties, or all three parties, or whoever is on the ballot for that particular seat. They receive this questionnaire. And you can find that on our website. And you can also find the responses. So when you get to the questionnaire on our website, you can see the questionnaire. You can see, you know, obviously what the questions are, but we have loaded the candidate responses, and we turn those over pretty quickly. So we actually are still receiving those. And if a candidate sends us their responses, we get them up on the web within 24 hours, 24 to 48 hours. So it's pretty fast. So I'm just telling you that that information is current, and it's all questions related to public education. And I encourage you to look at that. So that's just another resource. Again, we don't endorse, but we are allowed to ask these questions of candidates and publish their responses. And I'm sorry I don't have that to show you on the screen. That's my fault. I will show you this, however. So at the beginning of the program, we told you that we're recording tonight's event, and this is where it's going to live. So Public Schools First NC has a YouTube channel. When you go to YouTube and you find us, it'll land you on our home page. You can see the word home over there on the left-hand side. You won't see the video on the home page. It's a little confusing, so I've circled the word videos, because if you click videos, that's where you'll see all of our webinars, and we have got a bunch. We've probably got 30 or more. We have done, you know, we were doing them before the pandemic, but we've certainly ramped that up since the pandemic, and there's a lot there, and I encourage you to look there. But that is where tonight's webinar will be archived. So it'll be under that videos tab on YouTube. And we are going to send you the link to the video as well. So you won't have to go hunting for it, but just if you want to know where it is. And I also want to draw your attention to all these other great webinars that we have. This is actually an old screenshot, so we've even got more than what you can see here. But one of the really good ones is called When Public Schools Reopen, and that was a conversation with some of our teacher friends about what schools should look like when we post-COVID, when we can go back into our buildings. It was done a couple months ago, and I want to draw your attention to that one. But again, tonight's webinar is going to live in this space.
Yeah, I would
And
also add that, if I can, just the League of Women Voters also, both the state and each of our separate leagues has web pages that talk about voting, the voting process, and has some excellent webinars about that too, questions that you might have about the early voting process, or you know, where your ballots go and how they're counted. Everything is on there, and each of us also has on our League of Women Voters website has an education page that, thanks to many of our members, is kept up to date. And there's all of these links that we've talked about too, to reports and current articles. Many of the leagues, Charlotte Mecklenburg just did a study around early childhood education, and Lower Cape Fear has one on the use of the opportunity scholarships and what happens with curriculum in those schools. So you can see a number of studies that are done as well. So I think that we've tried to, Lynn, you've done an excellent job in terms of giving us not just an overview, but really a good idea about what is in what Leandro is and what the West Ed report is. And I think each of our organizations, Chatham Ed has the same thing on their site, seeks to help you dig deeper, delve more into those issues. And if there's something that we're missing, we would invite you to send us the questions so that we can do a job of getting that information up for people.
Absolutely.
Speaking of that, just before we wrap up, we do have a few more questions that have come in.
Well, and we're running ahead of time, so I'd love to hear those.
All right, terrific. The first one is, what does this all mean for special needs children and meeting their needs?
That is a great question. I have actually been through the West Ed report, and I do not recall them having a particular section about special needs students, but without question, there are a lot of needs there. And, you know, they've been there for a long time, and we need to continue to advocate for our children that have special needs. Unfortunately, I don't know that that was specifically addressed in the Leandro case and in the West Ed report, and I have, you know, reviewed that material.
Okay, next is, how can we mobilize in a concerted manner to demand accountability?
I just, you know, so in an election year, I mean, let's start, you know, with the next weeks ahead of us. You need to find out where your candidates stand on Leandro, where your candidates stand on public school funding, where your candidates stand on private school vouchers, where your candidates stand on special education funding, where your candidates stand on you know, providing children a sound basic education. Have they read the West Ed report? What do they think about those recommendations? Beyond that, obviously voting, you know, is huge, but beyond that, I think we just have to keep pounding, as they say. We got to keep talking to our networks. We've got to keep talking to our lawmakers, regardless of the election outcome in your particular district. You know, whoever is elected as your state senator and your state house member, you know, contact them about Leandro, contact them about the West Ed report. When the first report comes out in December, you might have to go digging for it, but it should get some media attention, and we will certainly report on it. You know, ask your lawmaker you know, in December, well, you know, what are your thoughts on the report that has been brought in, you know, in December when that time comes, and just keep talking about it. I've got a very good friend who is the child of educators from Lenoir County, and I saw her about a month ago and was telling her about this event, and I've had a couple events in the last week about this topic. She had never heard of Leandro, and she's the adult child of educators. So we can't, we've just got to keep talking about it and keep telling our networks about it and tell people to speak up and demand that our children get the education that they deserve.
Lynn, that's great. And I would also add that I know for the League of Women Voters, many of the local leagues have education teams that meet on a regular basis, study all of these issues, and are active in terms of providing public forums, meeting with local education officials, and even working up in Raleigh, trying to advocate for specific. We're all based on the positions of the national, state, and local leagues. We're position driven, but we do a lot of that advocacy work. So people that are interested in joining those efforts, and I can speak for our education foundation, and I know many are the same. Local education foundations are not just raising money to help support and offset county needs. We're also advocates. So you can look at, there's many organizations like that.
Okay, and finally we have, as local districts are given more responsibility for funding, this of course makes greater inequity issues. Can you speak to this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, counties like Wake and Durham and Charlotte-Mecklenburg and Forsyth, we have the local resources to give teacher pay supplements. I don't remember what slide it was, but one of the recommendations was to make it easier for low wealth districts to compete with teacher recruitment and teacher retainment. And what that boils down to is that counties like Wake or Mecklenburg or Forsyth, et cetera, Durham, they have the resources to offer. So whatever the state salary is for teachers, these higher wealth counties have the ability to offer supplements so that they pay their teachers better. And we recruit teachers in Wake County from our lower wealth neighbors. And that's not, fair to the kids in those lower wealth districts. They deserve every bit of qualified teachers as the kids in Wake County does, or the kids in Durham County, or what have you. So another supplement, if you will, counties can provide more funds for per pupil spending, where the state, remember I said that as a state, we're 46 in the country in per pupil funding, but our higher wealth counties can supplement the per pupil funding for supplies and materials for their students, where our lower wealth districts, struggle to do that because they just don't have the tax base in their county to do that. And another category would be helping professionals. I know that Wake County has funded, where the state doesn't provide enough social workers, enough counselors, Wake County is able to supplement, and other counties too, it's not just Wake, but our higher wealth counties are able to hire more counselors, more social workers, more school nurses with local dollars, because the state doesn't provide enough that are needed. And that is not equitable across the state. Our lower wealth counties, again, those students deserve every bit of the resources that our higher wealth counties are able to offer.
In fact, that is the case of that is what Leandro is all about.
Absolutely.
Right.
That's how it all started, was because rural counties were not getting the fair treatment. And this is a responsibility. Funding public education is a state responsibility. And as they've shunned that responsibility and pushed it down more and more to the local level, as Lynn says, that's not equal, because local level does not have the same tax basis, does not have the same wealth in the county. So what we have done here is we've created have and have not schools. We've created an unequal access to education, and that is unconstitutional and, in our view, unethical.
Zena, do you have any others?
That's it. Unless anything pops up in the next moment, because every time I say we don't have any, something pops up.
Well, I'm just glad that I can't be blamed for running us over time. We are on time.
You know, Lynn, I can't thank you enough, and everyone that participated in this, you know, the members from Charlotte Mecklenburg and from Lower Cape Fear, Chatham Ed Foundation. You know, we started planning this, well, I think last February, with the Orange Durham Chatham League, and it's grown because of your input and your involvement into what we had tonight. Actually, I guess the silver lining to COVID is that we're able to reach more people by doing it virtually. And so we're very thankful. We really urge people to use all of the resources that you talked about tonight, and to, if you have any additional questions, you can access any of us through our specific organizations, or I think through Public Schools First. Thank you for all the, Yvonne, you know, thank you for all the work that you all do. We really, really appreciate it.
Well, we have to
Thank you.
kudos back to the league too, because not only are the local branches, but statewide, the league is doing incredible work around equity and education, as well as access to the voting and to the booth. So we appreciate that. And Lynn, you did an outstanding job. Thanks.
Yay, thank you, Lynn.
Oh, thank you. It really was an honor. I appreciate it.
Good evening.
Good night.